The fact that it hasn't worked out begs many questions. Why? Because all the people they have hired and have since left all came from high pressure jobs in prestigious companies where there was plenty of stress and hard work, and probably, tempers can flare from time to time. My name is Michael Cole. I'm a writer and commentator and broadcaster on royal and media topics. It seems to be that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex have difficulty holding on to their senior staff. By my count, in recent days at Montecito, their headquarters in California on their hilltop redoubt, they have lost the services of 7 senior people, and they've all been fairly short stay. It is rumored that there is a Sussex Survivors Club of people who've worked for them, but no longer work for them. Now, the exact circumstances of this man's departure, and he was chief of staff, and he'd been with them on a visit to Nigeria, so he was well entrenched, but he's gone. The circumstances are unclear. Perhaps he will want to make them clear. But I think it is worth noting that when the Sussexes were still working members of the royal family based in London, there were 2 instances where personal assistants to the Duchess, to Meghan, quit. And there were allegations of bullying, which were taken seriously by Buckingham Palace. And there was an inquiry carried out. The results of that inquiry have never been made public. Meghan, it must be said, denied all suggestion that she'd ever bullied staff. So maybe there was a culture clash between the culture of the film industry in California, from which Meghan Markle emerged, and the rather genteel civil service aspect of working for the royal family at Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. I do not know. It's a quirk of the system that at Buckingham Palace, secretaries aren't called secretaries, they're called lady clerks. And that will maybe give you an indication of how, perhaps quaintly and a little bit from the past, the royal family is. But that's not to their discredit. I think there's a great deal to be said for courtesy and politeness at all stages. So there was a clash. The fact that the report has never been published is quite interesting. But as I say, the Sussexes in California deny any thought, suggestion, or intimation that the Duchess was in any way bullying to the people who were working for her. It might be said also that the Princess of Wales, Kate, there's never been ever any complaints about her behaviour to staff, perhaps in contrast. This chief of staff came with very high recommendations. He was supposed to be the very best in the business. He'd worked in prestigious companies in America, and he was thought to be ideal for holding the hand, figuratively, of Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, in the next stages of his life in California, working with his wife with their Archwell Foundation. The fact that it hasn't worked out begs many questions. Why? Because all the people they have hired and have since left all came from high pressure jobs in prestigious companies where there was plenty of stress and hard work, and probably, tempers can flare from time to time. The BBC, when I was there, it was called creative tension. I don't know whether there was too much creative tension around the place, but the fact of the matter is that at least 7, by my count, of people who had been working for them have said, enough of this, I'm going. And one person, I think, even went on a tour with them, and even halfway through the tour decided this is not for me, and bailed out. I think the question is this. It's a question of culture, I think, to some extent, because in the film industry, it's a tough world. If your eyes are not blue enough or the wrong shade of blue, you get fired. People, it's very peremptory. People want things now. They want things done properly. There's sometimes little time for the small courtesies of life, which make the world go round. And perhaps having come from that world, which is also a highly pressured world, and you're only as good as your last series or your last performance or your last film. Maybe that didn't translate terribly well to the rather more sedate and polite world, shall we say, of the British court here in London. We don't know because we weren't there. And the fact is that the report, which was carried out under civil service rules by Buckingham Palace into those allegations, has not been published. But suffice it to say that the two people who felt moved to leave their royal service felt they had to do so. And if there were reasons for that, then perhaps they ought to be explained. And also, perhaps they ought to be explained to Meghan. Sometimes in this world, and I'm not talking specifically about the Sussexes, people say and do things they don't realize how they're construed by other people. It may be called insensitiveness or it may be called crassness, but it can happen in all sorts of worlds, in all sorts of fields. And if it happened, I think the best thing would always be to confront what the problem is, bring the people together and see if accommodation can be made. And if people need to say sorry or to explain why they were saying what they did say, then maybe that's all to the good. I think this is all part of office life, wherever it's lived, whether it's at a paper factory in Slough or whether it's at Buckingham Palace. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have been invited to go to Colombia in South America, Bogota. And there's been criticism in that country, a warning, in fact, that they are being used by the presiding government of Colombia at the moment. The government is one of controversy. It has been mired in one scandal after another. And the accusation coming from within Colombia, from opponents of the present government, is that the government there will be using their prestige to their own purposes. Now, the Sussexes have got only one thing to sell, and that's their celebrity. And they must be sure, and must be certain, they must be careful not to sell their celebrity too cheaply and to whom they sell it. Because there are people out there who would gladly use a little bit of royal stardust or semi-royal stardust, semi-detached royal stardust, to their own purposes, to improve their own image or the image of their government. I feel concerned for them to some extent because they really need the expertise and experience of Buckingham Palace. Before any royal visit is ever undertaken, it's carefully considered and it's carefully researched before they ever agree to go anywhere or to see anyone. And there are good reasons for that. I mean, the late Queen had very few regrets, but one of them was the fact that the dictator, the tyrant dictator of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, was invited in 1978 on a state visit to England. And he was a controversial figure from the Eastern Bloc, but he came, and it was said that he was staying at Buckingham Palace with his wife, and he was wandering around the grounds, and the Queen was out in the grounds, and she saw him, and she actually hid behind a bush because she didn't actually want to speak to him. Well, 11 years after that visit, the people of Romania rose up against the tyrant Ceausescu, and he and his wife were shot by a firing squad on Christmas Day. And it was said at the time that this news was greeted with some solemnity at Sandringham, where the royal family was gathered for Christmas. And the big story was what happened to the black Labrador hunting dog that the Queen had given to Ceausescu as a gift during his state visit, knowing him to be a very keen shooter, a huntsman out in the forests of Romania. So the royal family do not want to hobnob with people who will use their celebrity for the wrong reasons. Now, they were invited, the Sussexes were invited by the vice president of Colombia, and her name is Francia Marquez. And she invited them and they accepted the invitation. She is the Minister for Equality and Justice in Colombia, but she has been criticized in her own country for riding around in helicopters and building her or improving a house instead of staying in the official residence for the vice president. And one quote in opposition to her said that Francia Marquez is the biggest fraud on the black community. She's a black woman herself. And so these are the elements which the Duke and Duchess of Sussex ought to be taking into account. It would be unwise for them to allow their royal status to be used, acquired, and misused by anyone else. Suffice it to say that this visit has not been approved by Buckingham Palace. The Sussexes do not discuss, do not consult, do not ask permission from Buckingham Palace about what they do. So as they go on their own independent way, they should be well advised. Now, maybe we can't say that their chief of staff, maybe he advised against it. We don't know that, but it could have been a point where he said, no, this is the place where you shouldn't go, because Colombia, which of course is a spectacular and wonderful country, places like Cartagena, there's a fabulous historic port, but it has had a terrible history in recent years, mainly caused by the drug cartels. I don't need to draw you a picture. Everybody knows what goes on, Pablo Escobar, etc., etc. So it is far from being a non-controversial country. It is a controversial country, and the government in power at the moment has had its fair share of scandals. It was the sort of place that, normally speaking, members of the royal family would think very much twice, maybe thrice, and then decide not to go. It's wonderful to see the Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Kate, making this very, very sincere and heartfelt message of congratulations to the British and the GB Olympic team upon their success in Paris, and encouraging. And that's entirely genuine. They're both huge sports fans. The Princess in particular, highly competitive. And when she's well and fit, she loves to take part in all sorts of sports, from sailing to tennis and so on. And without doubt, they would have been there in Paris doing their bit in person, cheering on the British competitors, had that been possible. But it was great to see them in this video. She looked a little bit, I thought, slightly wan, but she looked well. And she looked, I think, slightly fuller faced than the last time we saw her. And she was then again, as a reminder, wearing her Breton sweater top, which of course is what she wore when she announced in her memorable and very courageous video when she told the world that she was undergoing treatment for cancer, as yet an unspecified cancer. She was wearing the same sweater. And you could see by the look in her eyes how genuine and how sincere everything she said was. Her husband, of course, has done what I suppose many men have done, but I never have. He's sort of grown a holiday beard. Now, I think probably quite a lot of men with bald heads get rather tempted to prove that they can grow hair at the other end of their face. And here we see him with a rather, I don't know, a bit of probably quite nice, straggly sort of beard. The video was shot at Anmer Hall, their Georgian manor house on the Sandringham estate in North Norfolk, where the family are out there at the moment, and the weather is absolutely glorious at the moment. And he's not the first person in the royal family, obviously, to wear a beard. King Edward VII at the start of the 20th century, from 1901 to 1910, had a full beard, as did his son, King George V, a small man but with a big beard. And after that, King George VI was clean shaven. And for most of the time, Prince Charles has always been clean shaven. But when he was in the Navy, he did grow a beard. And I think he went home on leave, and I think his mother told him to get rid of it promptly, which he did. And then he favored sort of having bushy bits of fur up here on his cheekbones, which I think was not a good look. And I think that went too. So there have been experiments, but it goes back. Prince Philip, the late Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, he grew a beard when he was in the Royal Navy too. So it goes through. I would be surprised if we saw William with that beard continue with it when he goes back to his full-time job, carrying out royal engagements. But we'll see. Perhaps his wife and his children will tell him they like it. It will be the children who will decide. They'll first of all give it a good pull. You can be sure of that. And they will say, Daddy, that looks awful, or Daddy, that looks okay. And I think probably it's going to be the opinion of Princess Charlotte that's going to win the day. This is all fascinating. Most of the very, very many flights that the late Queen made were on aircraft of the Queen's flight. They were her own personal aircraft, serviced and protected and provided by the Royal Air Force. But occasionally she would go on a British Airways flight to somewhere which was hard to reach. And what has happened here is that one of the flight attendants, Miss Evans, has kept one or two souvenirs. One of them is a list of instructions about what to do when the Queen was on the flight. In other words, make sure she had the right pillows, which she wanted to have asleep. And I know that the royal family rather favoured pillows stuffed with hops, dried hops, which were made by a firm in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, I remember. And I think Prince Charles was also a fan of hop-filled pillows. And it also said that before the Queen arrived anywhere, she liked to have a short sleep, and they should make sure that she had the conditions to have a nap. And before she met anybody really important, she liked to have a dry martini, and she also liked to have about her a certain brand of mints, which she enjoyed. But I must just say that she didn't particularly like flying, and in fact, she absolutely hated going in helicopters, and she only did that twice. But obviously, the nature of the job of head of state meant that she had to go around the world, and these things happened. Now, I'm wondering if this flight attendant was on a flight serviced by British Airways, which I happen to know something about. And the Queen went to Belize in Central America. It was the last Commonwealth country she'd ever been to. She'd never been there before. And it was a successful visit. And British Airways had a very beautiful new plane. And she got on board at the end of the visit. And she took off, and the pilot asked her if she'd like to come into the cabin. And the Queen sat there. And he said, would you like to fly very low over the coral reef? And Belize has the second biggest coral reef in the world. So the Queen said she would. And they flew over this coral reef. And in the back of the plane, all the courtiers were sitting and standing and drinking and enjoying the success that they just had with this visit. But when the coral reef ran out, the pilot then took the plane right up to the cruising height very, very steeply. This meant that all the courtiers in the back of the plane were thrown into a heap all on top of each other with their drinks everywhere. Well, when the Queen got back to her special little compartment, she was rather amused to see them sort of straightening their ties and getting the lemon pieces from their gin and tonics off their posh suits. So that is the Queen's flying history. She was, of course, the most traveled monarch there had ever been. And over 70 years, she went to more than 100 countries on state business. The Queen, as I say, didn't particularly enjoy flying, but she accepted it as part of the job. And very, very occasionally, if it was an extremely difficult place to reach and the media could not get there except going on the royal plane, and the media were allowed to go in a very small area at the very back of the plane on the royal plane, because Her Majesty the Queen wanted there to be media coverage. She said that she had to be seen to be believed. And her press secretary, Michael Shea, once said to me, 50% of the Queen's job is being seen. He said that's why she always wears bright colours. She doesn't particularly like bright colours, but she knows it helps people to see where she is. And I remember once when we had to get to a small island in the Bahamas called Eleuthera, and there was a big American air base there, air base and a Navy base, and they tested submarines for anti-submarine protection. And when we got there to the United States Air Force base, we were not allowed in because of an administrative failure. And so the Queen was inside the base having a demonstration about how the submarines were tested underwater between the islands of the Bahamas at this American air base. And so she said to the press secretary, "Where's the press?" So he said, "They haven't been allowed in. The Americans have stopped them coming in." So she said, "Well, what's the point of me being here listening to this if they're not there?" She said, "Let's go." So eventually I spoke to the commanding officer and I said to him, "This has been a bit of a cock up, hasn't it? You haven't allowed us in and the Queen's now gone." So he said, "I'm not familiar with the term cock up." So I said, "Well, what about the American term snafu?" "Oh, yes," he said, "yes, it's definitely been a snafu." And the only shot we ever had then was of the royal barge disappearing towards the royal yacht at the end of that visit. So occasionally, but very occasionally, one went on the royal aircraft, whether it was a Queen's flight aircraft or a British Airways flight.